Hey, we are back at it, Mr. Cummings. We are going into chapter 27, which will be looking at the civil rights predominantly throughout these presidential administrations. So let's get after it. So to begin, we'll look at a civil rights timeline. This will take us all the way back to the early days of colonial, will bring us forward so we have a fundamental understanding as we move into the civil rights period itself and the history behind it. So looking at the colonial and antebellum periods, antebellum again means before the Civil War. The first major date is 1619. That is when the first slaves definitely show up to Virginia. 1676 is when we have Bacon's Rebellion. This is the free white poor farmers on the western frontier, as well as indentured servants, rising up and convinces leadership that indentured servitude is really not a thing to be using. And you see a major shift towards African-based chattel slavery. 1774, you have the Quakers. These are the colonial first kind of anti-slavery group located predominantly in Pennsylvania, William Penn, etc. 1776, very famous, important year in American history. The Declaration of Independence has the phrase, all men are created equal. That will be an important phrase going forward, but it will not be in practice during 1816 is the American Colonialization Society. Again, the ACS was a way to try to answer the issue of slavery in the United States, in part by creating colonies in Africa and sending slaves over there back to Africa. The problem they're going to run into, as well as free African Americans, but the problem they're going to run into on this one is that by 1816, it's not really back to Africa. So even as slaves, they are American, culturally, linguistically, things like that. 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, very important, very prominent abolitionist, publishes his Liberator, which is a newspaper that uses very fiery rhetoric about the abolition of slavery, immediate and uncompensated abolition of slavery is what Garrison wants. 1857, we're fully into the end of the antebellum period. By this point, the Civil War is on the horizon. The Supreme Court hands down the Dred Scott decision. They try to answer the question of slavery and say that African Americans will not be citizens. They can't be in the court. Slavery can go wherever, and tries to address conflicts created by the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, and it pretty much blows up in their face. And the Civil War is coming in just a few short years. So the Civil War, 1865, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation begins to shift the focus of the war. And by 1865, we are passing and ratifying the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. In response, Southern states begin to quickly enact what are called black codes. These are a series of laws, codes, ordinances that are pretty much designed to create slavery by another name. They restrict African American freedoms, where they can work, what they can work, where they can live, etc., in an effort to recreate slavery. Can't call it slavery, but if I can create economic slaves, I've in essence created the same thing. The 14th Amendment will get ratified. This should be a very critical amendment, as it is equal protection under the law, citizenship, and due process. It will not be universally applied, but will be the amendment in the civil rights movement that is the window into achieving the accomplishments that are achieved. Official congressional reconstruction begins. So Lincoln has been assassinated. Radical Republicans are in charge. 1870 sees the passage of the 15th Amendment. This was the universal male suffrage vote, allowing African American men to vote. 73, the slaughterhouse cases, and you can combine them with the 76 Cruikshank cases, where basically the Supreme Court starts rolling back those amendment protections. They basically are saying that the amendments protect you from the federal government, but the states really are responsible for protecting your civil rights, et cetera. And Mississippi's not really going to be too keen on protecting the civil rights of African Americans, even though a Civil Rights Act in 1875 was passed. It's not really going to be able to do much. A lot of these things get declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as well. And then the Reconstruction ends with the Compromise of 1877 and the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. So as Reconstruction comes to an end, you then can shift into the rise of what we'll call the Jim Crow era, or the era of segregation. In 1883, you have what are called the civil rights cases. These tackle issues of equal protection. They overturn the Civil Rights Act. So these are a series of cases that are not in favor of African Americans. 1895, you have Booker T. Washington, very important guy to know, gives his Atlanta Compromise speech. And again, his goal for equality will be to pursue vocational skills, job skills at his Tuskegee Institute, for example. And once you have acquired job skills and acquired a certain economic value, then maybe you'll be treated more equally. Contrast that with W.E.B. Du Bois as one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's America's oldest civil rights organization. And he's going to say through things like the Talented 10th, et cetera, go get your education and equality immediately. Mixed in with all of this is you have the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. This is a major Supreme Court case. It is the one that says separate but equal is legal. So it legalizes segregation in the country. Williams v. Mississippi upholds a literacy test. So another way to keep African Americans from voting, even though the 15th Amendment is in place, is they would implement things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Literacy tests are tests designed to fail you. They'll be used up into the civil rights period. Poll taxes are taxes that you have to pay, like a fee, in order to vote. And of course, these things are aimed at disenfranchising African Americans. The Ginn v. U.S. overturns grandfather clauses. Early on, they'd use grandfather clauses to say if your grandfather could vote in X year, then, excuse me, you do not have to pass the literacy test to pay the poll tax. They would cherry pick the years in order to that only white people would be able to do this, and thus exempting them, because there's a lot of poor people, a lot of uneducated people in the South that would have gotten, whites that would have gotten rolled up in those tests as well. So the grandfather clause is out, but by 1915, the system's crystallized in place. 1920, we're moving into the Harlem Renaissance now, so you can throw in Marcus Garvey. He starts the United movement, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism is done by him. You also have Langston Hughes as a very famous poet during this time period, and this is all centered around Harlem Renaissance. Another court case, Nixon v. Herndon, saying de jure white primaries are unconstitutional. One of the things we'll see is the difference between de jure and de facto. So de jure means of or by the law, so you're looking at legal issues, and then de facto is by custom or tradition. So de jure white primaries being unconstitutional, there were laws white people could be on juries. So that's going to fall by the wayside. 31 is 1931 Scottsboro trial. Again, this is going to be a trial very much against African Americans. So we do see some gains here, but the legal system by far is tilted very much against African Americans in the country, even moving into the 20th century. The Ku Klux Klan is very powerful during this time period. The 1920s really is their heyday of power, if you will. And so very, very dangerous time, very, very limited time for African Americans. All right, so a lot on this slide, but 1941, so we're on the verge of World War II. World War II is already going on in Europe. A. Philip Randolph threatens FDR with a march on Washington and an African American restriction of labor, etc. So FDR will do Executive Order 8802 that bans discrimination in federal agencies and war-related jobs. And the FEPC is the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which is created to implement Executive Order 8802. Why is FDR doing this? He doesn't really do much for civil rights. The New Deal doesn't really do much. It's because of the threat of the war. You don't want labor disruptions. You don't want racial strife on the beginnings, basically, of American entry into World War II. The following year, the Congress of Racial Equality is founded by James Farmer, and the Double V campaign begins. This is going to be a victory in the war for African Americans. And then the second V will be victory at home in civil rights. World War II will have a profound effect on the civil rights movement. You're overseas fighting to liberate people from tyranny, and then you come home to a segregated, racist America. Those two things really contradict one another. So fighting for freedom will kind of stoke the coals of the fight back home in the civil rights movement. So Smith v. Alwhite in 1944, you have de facto primaries being unconstitutional now. So how do you get a de facto primary? You can do it a variety of ways. Just the judge not picking African Americans, lawyers not picking them, do it through districting where people live, etc. but all of that's gone. So 44, you've got the Myrtle publishes an American Dilemma book. And then again, this is highlighting the inequality issues. Morgan v. Virginia integrates interstate commerce now. So we're bringing those together. Truman will create the civil rights. Truman is one of the first presidents to really look at civil rights and try to do something about it. He is also looking at the Cold War once World War II was over, and the Soviet Union can use racism and segregation in America as a hammer against the United States and say that we talk very large about freedom and equality, but we don't even treat our own people that way, and can use that as like a ding against us. So we try to address it from a geopolitical issue as well. 1947, Jackie Robinson joins baseball, integrates baseball as a major deal for sports. Mexican schools are declared unconstitutional in Menendez versus Westminster. Shelley v. Kramer gets rid of restricted covenants. These are a lot of times within neighborhoods. You'd have contracts when you buy a home, et cetera, that you can't sell or rent to African Americans. Truman will integrate the military as well, making the Korean War the very first integrated war. And the Dixiecrats will split off in response. We touched on this in the Cold War chapter because Truman, as a Democrat, is pushing civil rights. So you have Southern Democrats, Dixie, Confederacy, Dixie. Dixiecrats are opposed to the civil rights actions. And then the American GI Forum is formed to protest treatment of Mexican American soldiers. So what we see here is it's not just African Americans. Now, the African American movement will be the one that's most focused on the longest history of racial inequality, et cetera. However, there are still other groups that have definitely been mistreated over the years. Mexicans, obviously Native Americans, women, gays and lesbians, all of these groups will have their own kind of follow-on civil rights movement in the same kind of vein of the African American civil rights movement. You've got the two cases there, Sweat v. Painter, McLaurin v. Oklahoma. These are looking at law schools. Sweat v. Painter is in University of Texas up in Austin. And this is saying that you can't, because Plessy v. Ferguson had always said separate but equal. So as long as the facilities were equal, then it was legal. Now that very rarely, if ever, are they actually equal in practice. And that's what they're getting dinged with in those court cases. And then the big one, the most important one on this slide probably is Brown v. Board of Education. And this ends segregation in schools. Thurgood Marshall had been a lawyer, a member of the NAACP, and is the first African American on the Supreme Court. And he's on the Supreme Court for Brown v. Board of Education. And this overturns in large part Plessy v. Ferguson. You then see a backlash by the whites throughout the country. Hernandez v. Texas is another win, saying that all racial groups have equal protection under the 14th. This is why the 14th Amendment becomes the most critical of the Reconstruction Amendments, is it will be the vehicle to arrive at decisions that rectify the mistakes of the past. So now we'll pick up with the actual civil rights movement. Some of this will overlap with our timeline. We talked about this already during the timeline. And then Earl Warren is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during this time period. And the Warren Court will significantly expand civil rights to a variety of people. A big one that the Warren Court will focus on will be criminally accused individuals. So the Warren Court is where you get the famous Miranda rights, the right to remain silent, et cetera, is under the Warren Court. And this will also be the Civil Rights Movement courts. So what we're going to see is that the South is becoming more like the rest of the country, slowly industrializing, suburbanizing, et cetera. And the rest of the country is becoming more like the South. How are they doing that? Segregated neighborhoods. You've got inner cities being largely minority, white flight, which we talked about, et cetera. How do you get a lot of African Americans in these northern cities? Well, the Great Migration is one of the big ones. This goes all the way back to World War I, where African Americans moved north seeking industrial jobs that are vacant because of the white soldiers going off to fight World War I. That will continue through the 20s, 30s, and again in World War II. And then the Cold War we touched on already. We kind of look disingenuous, telling everybody else how evil the Soviets are, et cetera. And we are the champions of equality and liberty when we're not even extending that to our own citizens. Touched on Brown v. Board. This is one of the landmark civil rights cases, again, in segregation in schools. case, and the phrase they used was that separate but equal is inherently unequal. You do see massive resistance by the Southerners. The 101 congressmen will pass the Southern Manifesto. 99 Democrats, 2 Republicans opposed to desegregation of public school space. The blow to segregating of schools was huge in the South. That was like one of the bedrock ways to segregate society, and so losing that, you do see a lot of Southerners get very upset. The KKK gets revived again. They drag them out for the white terrorism, and we're going to have kind of this conflict and this fight. Emmett Till's murder in 1955 is a major catalyst. Emmett Till was a young African American boy from Chicago, went down to Mississippi in the summer to visit some family members. They're at basically the equivalent of like a convenience store. And allegedly, as Emmett Till was leaving, he either kind of whistled at or said bye, baby, to the white woman working the register. Her husband and another white individual would show up that night, drag Emmett Till out of his house in his sleep, and take him and brutally murder him. They'd hit him in the head with an axe. They would shoot him. They do all kinds of terrible things to him, and then they would drop his body tied to a cotton gin fan in a river to be found several days later. And the body is unrecognizable. And his mother, to her credit, has an open casket funeral so the world can see what Mississippi did to her boy. And really, this is a major kind of sparking thing of the civil rights movement. It's covered on television. Television will play an important role in the civil rights movement as well. And it's a terrible thing, and it really highlights the brutality of. All right, so what's really going to kick this off as far as the actual civil rights movement for this chapter really is the emergence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He is kind of your go-to name during this movement, and the Montgomery bus boycotts. They're going to do what are called direct action campaigns, where they directly act against segregation laws in the South. Rosa Parks very famously refuses to give up her seat. You have what's known as the Montgomery Improvement Association. This is run by 3 individuals, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Edgar Nixon. They will then guide the bus boycott. One of the things Martin Luther King will focus on is nonviolence, doing boycott sit-ins, things like that. The reason the boycott's going to be very successful predominantly the ones who use the bus. So if they're not using the bus, those bus companies aren't making money, and it's putting pressure on city politics, etc. Martin Luther King emerges out of the boycott as a major civil rights leader. And one of the things we'll also see is he's not the only civil rights leader. The civil rights movement is not monolithic. There will be multiple organizations operating in different parts, doing different strategies, all moving towards the same goal, but based on their leadership, believe different paths can achieve that. But the bus boycott is very nationally known, and it does ultimately end up being successful. And what they're fighting against is the segregation of the bus space. African Americans had to give up their seats to whites, sit in the back where it was louder, dirtier, etc. And they're fighting against that, and they're using the power of their dollar, as in taking it away, to be successful. Continuing on, we'll look at the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This puts us into the Eisenhower years. Civil rights created this is to look at the voting issues that are going on in the country, the limiting and restricting of the African American vote, predominantly in southern states. Little Rock High School, this is one of the first challenges to Brown v. Board of Education. Schools have been desegregated. Southern states will resist that. Surprise, surprise. And you have the segregationist governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, and he will keep the schools closed until President Eisenhower sends in the soldiers. And the United States Army has to go into Little Rock to make sure 9 African-American students can integrate Little Rock High. An incredible show of bravery by these students because, yes, the soldiers are there on the street. Yes, they are allowing you to walk to school, but they're not in the stairwells. They're not in the bathrooms. They're not in the classrooms. And these 9 students faced an incredible amount of racism, numerous threats, terrible things for the audacity of daring to want to go to school. It's incredible that we would have 1960. That is not a long time ago. There are people alive in the United States today that can remember themselves integrating schools. And so this is a very important chapter and builds the bedrock of the diversity that we have in our classrooms today. We talked about racial conflict not being helpful to America's geopolitical goals. We can't really say we're containing communism because communism is evil and we're making the world safe for liberty and freedom and equality when we're not even doing that at home. 56 and 58 create divided elections. Eisenhower wins re-election, but yet the Democrats take over Congress in 1958. And then you'll have the urban-suburban divide growing in America as well. Whites leaving the inner city, white flight. Redlining is basically where we're not going to give you loans and access to certain financials because of where you live. That's going to disproportionately target African Americans. And then again, the restrictive covenants as well, where you can rent or sell to African Americans. All are creating a divide within the city structure. Jumping to 1960, this is the election of John F. Kennedy. So he is going to be a little cautious on civil rights early on. He is not going to jump in head first. You do see sit-in movements occurring. This is where you literally sit in. You use your body to physically occupy space to prevent business going on. This is very famously done at lunch counters in different places, restaurants in the South. And these kids would face all kinds of attacks. People would pour hot coffee on them. They'd dump food on them to dehumanize them, to injure them. And again, they're daring to fight for equality. You have rides. This is where they would purposely ride on Greyhound buses in violation of interstate transportation segregation laws. These buses would end up getting firebombed at times. And so people are literally putting their lives on the line for what they believe in. You have SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Albany movement is one of the ones they're going to be involved in early on. This is Albany, Georgia. They bring in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King as well. Kind of splits the group a little bit. They have different goals and different paths to get there. And the Albany movement it kind of fizzles a little bit. But again, you do see it highlights the different organizations involved in this process. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will then move to Birmingham and what are called Project C, or for confrontation, where they're going to openly confront the segregation laws. Birmingham has the nickname of Bommingham because of the number of bombs and violence that takes place in Birmingham. It's also known as the most segregated city in the South. So Dr. King will write very famously the letter from a Birmingham jail where he criticizes Christian leadership, etc. You know, they're not really living up to the Christian teachings, and the Children's March as well, using children. The big march we need to talk about here is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This is the famous I Have a Dream speech from Dr. Martin Luther King, has an impact on John F. Kennedy, pivots him towards more civil rights actions. Unfortunately, Kennedy is going to be assassinated later in 1963. But this is the famous speech that Dr. King gives, where he talks about that his daughter will be judged by the content of her character, not the color of her skin. A very famous speech, brings a bunch of people together, and is one of the most influential speeches in the latter 20th century for sure. So here we see some examples of the protests in the top left. So you can see the sit-in type stuff happening. Top right is one of the buses being firebombed. Nobody was killed in that incident, but there are threats. The Birmingham is also very famous, which you can see in the two bottom left pictures, for the church bombing that killed the young African American girls. But you would see them turn out the dogs. You would see them turn out the fire hoses on people. And this is televised. This is photographed. These will be on TV channels and newspapers all over the country, and really highlights to a bunch of people the, oh my God, I can't believe this actually occurs response. That yes, people were aware of segregation, etc., but you see dogs actively attacking people. You see the fire department turning hoses on people who are not violently protesting, not looting, but standing in a march. And it really creates this stark image. And that's why they're in our history books today, because you can look at them and they're stunning to see. And again, not that long ago. And then on the right, you have Dr. King Jr. there, and that's at the March on DC, where he gives the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. All right, so the big law we need to be aware of, the culmination, really kind of what a lot of these fights are for, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Creates the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You can see there requires federal contracts to take affirmative action to ensure applicants are employed. Their employees are treated during employment without regard to color, creed, or national origin. So those are the four categories that are originally added in the Civil Rights Act. Title VII will come by and create gender title for employment. Title IX, which we'll talk about later, looks at education. Title IX is very important for women. They will add on mental capacities as well, and the gay, lesbian categories will be added into this over time. So Civil Rights Act 64 seen as a major victory, but seen as a beginning victory. This is not the end. It's not like after this law is passed, everyone's like, cool, we're equal. And everyone's like, yeah, you're equal. And we're going to move forward and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, not by any stretch of the imagination. Freedom Summer looks at voting specifically in Mississippi. The murder of those three individuals, these were young guys who went down to register people to vote, ran afoul of the Ku Klux Klan and the law, and were murdered. This is a civil rights movement where people, both whites and blacks, a lot of northern whites come down to the South to help out, which then further creates animosity because the Southerners are like, why are you coming down here? But this is it's not just an African American movement. It's largely led by African Americans for sure, and not take anything away from them. But it does show that there are people in the country who do cooperate, who do see equality as colorblind, and will work and put their lives on the line in order to achieve that. In those three cases, two of those young men are white. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Fannie Lou Hamer challenges the all-white Democrat Party because they are still segregated, and you see her push back. So you see African Americans begin to take a political voice as well. Dr. King will do the March on Selma there, and that's the very famous one. They're going to march across the bridge in Selma. They are greeted by law enforcement, and the nightsticks come out, and violence ensues as protest in the march. The Voting Rights Act of 65 gets passed. It tackles voting rights issues. The 24th Amendment will get ratified. This abolishes the poll tax. So you begin to see the pillars of Jim Crow segregation being torn down at the very foundation, and which is a good thing. We'll add on the Civil Rights Act of 68 here in a second to form kind of the three that you need to know. Civil Rights Act of 64, ending segregation. Voting Rights Act of 65, and then the Civil Rights Act in 68, which looks at housing issues predominantly. Those are the big three that we need to know. Voting Rights Act also abolishes literacy tests. 24th Amendment comes in and knocks out poll taxes. So here we can see the missing poster for the three young men during, notice it's FBI, so you're getting federal law enforcement agents down here to investigate these crimes, because you're not going to be found guilty. That was the other thing about Emmett Till. When they had the trial for the two guys who murdered him, they're found not guilty in less than an hour. And one of the jurors, when interviewed about it, he said it would have been a shorter amount of time if we hadn't stopped to have a Coke. And that was the attitude towards African American victims. And this goes all the way back. Think back to Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching campaign that she had run during the early 20th century, and the crimes that had been committed in the late 19th century. So this is a long fight where fair justice is a figment of the imagination in many southern states. Here you have Hamer over here on the right pleading her case for the political issues. So once you get the Civil Rights Act starting to come through, you're attacking the legal aspect of Jim Crow laws, et cetera. Now you have to start moving to the de facto segregation that's going to be in the more northern states. The problems with this is de facto is changing custom and tradition. That's much harder to do. The Civil Rights Act knocked out segregation, or discrimination, excuse me. The Brown v. Board of Education eliminated segregation in schools. If there's a law in place, you change the law and now we're done. But changing people's hearts and minds and the way people live lives is much more difficult. The Watch riots kick off in 65, showing a lot of racial angst, violence as a outsource of that angst and pent up frustration. You begin to see guys like Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad coming along with Nation of Islam, black nationalism, black separatism. Stokely Carmichael will take over SNCC, radicalizing that organization and calling for black power. You can see the quote there. Notice too that as we move into the mid to late 60s, the other thing that's going on in the country during this time period is going to be the Vietnam War, which will also be very unpopular amongst young people, and will have a whole host of anti-war protests that will tie in to African American civil rights movements as well. Very famously, the boxer Muhammad Ali will refuse to be drafted and spend time in jail for that. Because the attitude is, why should African Americans go fight and die for a country that in an unpopular war 5,000, 7,000 miles away, for a country that doesn't like them, that won't even give them civil rights and equality. So you begin to see the later 60s take on a more angry tone, civil rights and anti-war. So you'll see the Black Panthers be founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. These are done kind of as African Americans to protect African American neighborhoods. They would run kind of like soup kitchen, food banks, do a lot of good things, daycare services in the community. They were listed as the FBI as the greatest threat to internal security in the country, over communism, by the way, in the 1960s. To give you an idea of the racial tensions of the period. You can see there they mix this kind of idea of black nationalism with the Marxist socialist doctrine, we take care of ourselves, community-driven type things, as a way to try to take care of a community that they feel is not being taken care of by the federal government. Civil Rights Act there of 68 prohibits discrimination of housing. You'll add gender in 74. And then in 88, the Fair Housing Act protects people with disabilities and families with children as well. So you see what starts out as a kind of a black-white civil rights issue over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years will get expanded out to different aspects of equality. 1968 becomes a very terrible year. Martin Luther King is assassinated in 68. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in 68. 68 will be a very, very tough year. So here are the Watts riots in the top left. You've got Malcolm X in the top right, Stokely Carmichael in the bottom left, and then the Black Panther Party in the bottom right. So very contentious time, and it is certainly not over in 1968 with the assassination of King. You see massive riots happen in response to that as well, and King kind of gets lionized as this great civil rights leader and an inspirational force going forward. He certainly is a major leader of the civil rights movement. His assassination is a blow to the movement, but galvanizes everybody as well to push for continued civil rights equality into the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the 20th century as well. You look at America today, the civil rights fight is not over. It is not a conflict that has a victory date yet. We're always pushing to be equal and treat everybody with the values contained within Thomas Jefferson's famous line, all men are created equal. So this is going to kind of conclude our civil rights period chapter. Always feel free to email with questions. Hope you guys are having a great day and enjoying your time.